We have the first major transaction of the offseason for the New York Mets. They have traded for a new center fielder, Jose Siri. We'll talk about what he brings to the table on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, so we got a trade. The New York Mets acquire a new center fielder, Jose Siri, in exchange for relief pitcher Eric Orze. This is a trade with the Tampa Bay Rays. So you got to be a little bit worried that Eric Orze is going to become some type of a superstar reliever in Tampa. That's definitely in the cards. You're looking at a guy in Orze that pitched to a 2.92 ERA in AAA this past year and over 60 innings pitched. Had a strikeout per 9 rate of 12.26. Guy who has some reverse splits because he has a devastating changeup. And you can just imagine them, taking up the usage of that changeup and turning Eric Orze into some relief ace over in Tampa. I think that is a possibility for sure, where maybe we're looking back on this trade and saying the Mets lost it because Eric Orze becomes some guy in Tampa. But if you really talk about value here, Eric Orze was far down the depth chart when it comes to Mets relief pitchers. We're going to talk in the final segment today about the Rule 5 deadline that just passed today, the non-tender deadline coming up. Some guys could fall off throughout this offseason if the Mets sign some relievers, sign some starting pitchers, sign some bats. That 40-man roster, those spots start to dwindle. A guy like Eric Orze might have been a casualty. So when you think about his stats with the Mets, not what he's going to become with the Rays, and then you understand what you just picked up on Jose Siri, I think this is another great trade by David Stearns where he fills the need and he doesn't give up too much to do it. Jose Siri is one of the best defensive center fielders in baseball. That's what you're getting. He's 29 years old. He comes with 3 years of team control. You're basically getting a younger, more athletic version of what you just had in Harrison Bader. That's what the Mets picked up here. This is a guy that was 8th in sprint speed in Major League Baseball this past year. He was tied with Brendan Doyle for the second best mark when it comes to outs above average, 16 outs above average. So that is elite defense out in center field, arm strength in the 97th percentile. Again, a younger, more athletic version of Harrison Bader. Really, you're talking about a better center fielder. Here's the issue with Jose Siri. He strikes out, and he strikes out a lot. This past year, he struck out about 38% of the time. For his career, he strikes out 36% of the time. He hit just 187 this past season, 255 on base, 366 slug. That's a 620 OPS. Harrison Bader really struggled down the stretch for the Mets. He finished the season with a 657 OPS. So offensively, you could say, oh, maybe it's a slight step down, but also you have to acknowledge that Jose Siri does have a positive trait when it comes to his offensive game. He can hit home runs. He hit 25 home runs in 2023, hit 18 home runs in a down offensive season in 2024. You now get him out of a really bad ballpark to hit in Tampa. City Field's a little bit more friendly to hitters because it's just hard to see in that ballpark in Tampa. So now maybe you get a little bit more out of him. But this is all about the defense for the Mets. And you have to think about the alternatives here, which will make you feel a little bit better about acquiring Jose Siri. I was going back and forth with one of our Locked On Mets insiders who did not like this deal because he is fearful of what Jose Siri is going to look like in the lineup and just imagining all these rallies that might go to die when Jose Siri comes up in a big spot and he strikes out almost 40% of the time. And that's a fair concern. He mentioned Harrison Bader being clutch. I talked about high leverage situations when we were going back and forth through text. And Bader this past year had a 668 OPS in high leverage situations. Jose Siri had a 752 OPS. Do I take that as Jose Siri is just an absolute animal who's going to come through in the clutch all the time? Not necessarily, but what I'm really trying to illustrate is you're not losing much offensively going from Bader to Siri. And when you think about center field, so we've talked about this offseason, it's one of the toughest positions to fill because it's so thin. In the free agent market, it's pretty much Harrison Bader and Michael A. Taylor. There is no clear-cut above-average starting center fielder that's available in free agency. There's just not a guy that you can turn to. On the trade market, we've talked about Cedric Mullins. Are the Orioles actually trading him, though, when their other outfield options at this point are really just Colton Cowser, Heston Kjerstad, and then maybe moving a Jordan Westburg out to the outfield with some of the infielders that have coming up, like a Kobe Mayo and Jackson Holliday getting a full go at second base? That they are thin when it comes to the outfield. So are they really going to trade Mullins? We don't know. I talked about trading for Cody Bellinger. That comes with a big salary. There's some risk in taking that on. Also, you don't know if the Cubs are even interested in dealing Cody Bellinger. They might be just as happy to keep him in the middle of their lineup. So you really didn't have a lot of options. And when it comes to Jose Siri, if you look at FWAR, which is Fangraphs wins above replacement, this takes into account base running, fielding, batting. How many wins is this player better than average, right? 6.3 is the amount of WAR that Jose Siri has racked up over the last 3 years. Harrison Bader has racked up 3.8. So Siri has been a much more effective player because he's so elite defensively, because he's got on the field a little bit more, and because he does have the power to hit 25 home runs like he did in 2023. Do I think he's definitely going to blast 25 home runs again? Not necessarily, but if he does, if he's able to get that on base percentage closer to 300 instead of being hovering around 250, and then you have the elite defense in center field, this guy could be an above average starting center fielder for you. But if not, he's at least going to be another guy that is going to give you a ton of speed and defensive versatility out there. We can play him in all three spots. You have Tyrone Taylor, so those two guys are going to be competing for playing time, very similar to what we saw this past year with Tyrone Taylor and Harrison Bader. And I also think that this opens the door still, or leaves the door open for one of your prospects to eventually grab that starting center field position. You just have these guys now in Siri and Taylor who are under team control. I think you still have 2 more years with Taylor, now 3 with Siri, of guys who are just great defenders, and they have a little bit of pop in their bats, but they're also wildly inconsistent offensively. In today's game, that's sort of to be expected with the center field position. You're just not going to find a lot of really above average hitters. So what does this mean for the Mets when it comes to their outfield plans for the rest of the offseason? How does this impact Juan Soto? Does it at all? And also, are they just out of the market for other center fielders? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5. You're going to get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. And again, you're going to get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. So make sure you find a bet that you're really confident in, one that you know is going to hit. And if it does, $150 in bonus bets are coming your way. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks in the Mets. So today, when they traded for Jose Siri, the first place I went was over to Subtext to let the insiders know. Then I was texting with some of them back and forth. It's a great way that we can engage throughout the offseason whenever the Mets make moves. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Now, what does this mean for the Mets and their plans for this offseason? Does this mean that they have some inside scoop? They feel like they're going to get Juan Soto, and this is the type of defensive center fielder that will pair brilliantly with him because it takes some pressure off Soto in right field if you have a guy that can cover as much ground as Jose Siri. In some ways, the pieces would fit together, but that's not what happened here. If you want to know why this trade happened, when it happened, you just have to look at the deadlines that are in place this offseason, because what Tuesday was the deadline to add players to your roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. The Tampa Bay Rays are always a team that is in a bit of a 40-man roster crunch. I'm sure they had to protect some people. They have the non-tender deadline coming up, and so they probably viewed Jose Siri as a guy that they're ready to move on from. They were maybe looking in other directions as far as how they're going to fill out their outfield next year, so they were probably shopping him a little bit, and they identified Eric Orze as a suitable return. The Mets saw an opportunity to get a really good defensive center fielder who's under team control, just like they did last year with Tyrone Taylor under very similar circumstances. Tyrone Taylor had no options left, so the Brewers were in a bit of that crunch. What are they going to do with him? Are they going to keep him? They didn't really feel like they were going to, so they called the Mets. They get a deal done. It's a very similar trade to the Tyrone Taylor deal last year, and that trade worked out very well for the Mets. You're now doubling down on it, and you're looking at center field, and you're saying, all right, we can go into next year with Jose Siri and Tyrone Taylor and feel good about it. Now, does that mean that that is set in stone? Opening day center fielder is Jose Siri? Not necessarily. I'd say he's probably the odds-on favorite at this moment, but it's going to be an open competition, and we went into last year talking about the Harrison Bader signing in a similar light, where I said, look, start of the year, it's going to be Harrison Bader's job, but as the season wears on, maybe you'd see a Drew Gilbert have a great run in AAA, and he would earn a promotion. And that was the guy I was sort of banking on last year to maybe be up by the All-Star break and to be the Mets center fielder of the future. He got hurt. We didn't really see him. Now his development has taken a little bit of a step back because of that. He's going to start this upcoming season in AAA most likely. But if Drew Gilbert gets off to a great start, he might end up being your starting center fielder. If Jet Williams tears the cover off the ball in AA, earns a quick promotion to AAA, and just shows that he is ready for the show, he could be your starting center fielder by midseason. And in spring training, Luisangel Acuna will have a shot to win a job. I think there's a good chance that we see Jose Iglesias sign with another team, because the infield class is so weak in free agency that I think he's going to be able to find a starting job somewhere. The Mets probably aren't able to offer that, and they have so much depth at the second base position. This is going to lead to an open competition in spring training between guys like Luisangel Acuna, like Brett Baty, like Ronnie Mauricio, to grab some of those last spots on the bench. And for Acuna, he has the ability to play center field. If he goes into spring training and he hits 350 and looks like the clear best option offensively over Siri, over Taylor, you never know. Luisangel Acuna could be your starting center fielder next year. There is that opening for one of the young guys to grab that starting center field job. But in the meantime, you have to have a good floor in place. And what Jose Siri provides you with is a glove in center field that your pitchers are going to love having out there, because he can go back on the ball, rob home runs. He can cover the gaps. He has a great arm. He is going to take a lot of pressure off of Brandon Nimmo in left. And if it's Starling Marte in right, it takes pressure off of him. If the Mets ultimately win the Juan Soto sweepstakes, he's going to take a lot of pressure off of Juan Soto. If long-term your outfield is going to have Nimmo in left and Soto in right, you really need to have a great defensive center fielder to cover up for the fact that Juan Soto is not the best fielder. I think Brandon Nimmo in left can be an above-average fielder for some time now, but he's also aging, and you don't want to have to move him back to center. So you want to keep him in left field, and this acquisition gives you more depth to be able to do that. So is Jose Siri going to be a 25-20 guy with Gold Glove defense in center field? That's the best possible outcome, but it's more likely that he might give you what we saw from him this past year. Might be 18 home runs. He might strike out 40% of the time. But even with that, he was a 2-win player thanks to his defense in center field. That's what the New York Mets traded for. And you look at their alternatives, what else they could have done this offseason, they probably couldn't have done much better. They might have been able to find a guy with a slightly better bat, maybe a slightly worse glove on the trade market at some point. But this was a bird in hand. The Rays were probably shopping him, like I said, with these deadlines that were present. Tuesday, it was the deadline to decide who you're protecting in the Rule 5 draft. Friday, I believe it is the non-tender deadline. So this is a time where some trades happen. The Mets saw an opportunity. They capitalized on it, and I think it was ultimately a really good trade to shore up a need. And now it's one less thing you have to worry about. You look at the Mets' needs. They still got to figure out what's going on with Soto. And if they don't sign him, potentially still targeting whether that's Teoscar Hernandez, Anthony Santander, Tyler O'Neill, trying to get some more power in their outfield, get a better bat out there. They have to look at Pete Alonso at first base. Are they keeping him? If they aren't, how are they replacing him? I think the Mets now have to focus very much so on the offensive side of things with their other additions to the lineup. Jesse Winker, could he come back, be a DH platoon partner with Starling Marte? There's a lot that they're going to work through, but this shores up a need in center field that probably could not have been addressed much better through other avenues. So you check that off, you focus on other things, getting some bats, getting some pitching. The Mets make a nice first big move, and there's still plenty more in store. What we're going to talk about in the final segment is the Rule 5 draft deadline for the Mets. They did not protect anybody. Who could they potentially lose in the Rule 5 draft? Also, the qualifying offer deadline was today. We'll talk about that a little bit. Manager of the Year votes have come in. We now know that Carlos Mendoza was snubbed. We'll go through all of that in the final segment. First, though, another quick word from our sponsors. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Our goal is to get to 11,000 subscribers. I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. We're within 200. We're getting closer and closer. So please hit that red button and subscribe. All right, so Tuesday was the Rule 5 draft deadline. This is where you had to add players to your 40-man roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. For those of you who aren't aware of what the Rule 5 draft is, when a player is signed at 18 years old or younger, they need to be added to the club's 40-man roster within 5 seasons, or they become eligible for the Rule 5 draft. The Rule 5 draft is a draft where all teams get their chance to draft unprotected players and add them to their major league roster. This is supposed to protect against a team that has a deep farm system that can't give opportunities to a guy that is clearly an MLB talent, ready to go, who is just blocked. This protects them from having to just wither away in the minor leagues. Now, a lot of times teams will look at this as an opportunity to poach a player who has some upside, who maybe isn't big league ready, but particularly with pitchers and for teams that aren't contending, like if you're looking at a Rockies or a Marlins, they might see an arm that they identified and say, oh, that could be a potential future starter for us or a high leverage arm. We're going to poach them in the Rule 5 draft, keep them in our bullpen all year, protect them from leverage, just have them in the pen on the roster. And if you get through the season with them, you now own that player. You have team control over them, and you don't have to worry about potentially giving them back to their parent team. If you can't hold on to them for the whole season, if you eventually decide that they have to be taken off your big league roster, they will go back to the original club. This happened with Daniel Nunez a couple years ago. He was selected in the Rule 5 draft. I believe it was by the Giants. Ultimately, they ended up returning him to the Mets. Now, it is, again, players who have signed at 18 years or younger, their first 5 years, they have with the big league team before they have to make that decision. Once they've been part of that organization for 5 years, you have to add them to the 40 or they're eligible for the Rule 5. When it comes to players who are signed at 19 years or older, so typically your drafted players out of college, they need to be protected within their first 4 seasons. So really for this period, we were looking at the 2021 draft class. So there was 2 names that jumped out above all else, and that is Mike Vasil and Dom Hamill. These are guys who are often featured in top 20 prospect lists for the Mets. They both were in Syracuse this past year, and you could have made the case to add them to the 40. I told you on this show I didn't think anyone would be added. That's what the Mets ended up doing here. Mike Vasil pitched to a 6.04 ERA in 134 innings this past year. So I thought they'd be able to push him through the Rule 5 draft. We'll see if they ultimately can. Dom Hamill pitched to a 6.79 ERA in 27 starts. We'll see if a team grabs either of them. I think it would be a little bit of a surprise for a team to grab them and to keep them on their roster all year. I think the Mets were right to not add these guys to the 40 when they didn't have to, but there is some risk you might lose them. Another guy to mention is Joander Suarez, guy who pitched to a 3.92 ERA and 119 and a third innings pitched in AA this past year, made 2 starts in AAA, gave up 12 runs. I think he's an interesting arm, but one that, again, the Mets feel like will pass through the Rule 5 draft without getting selected. When it comes to position players, there's really not many that you should mention. JT Schwartz is one, but I don't think anyone's taken him. Luke Ritter, if he gets an opportunity through the Rule 5, I think that's awesome because I don't know if he's ever going to get that shot with the Mets. Hit 26 home runs this past year, drove in 93, had an 849 OPS, but never got the call to the big leagues. Other names to mention, Hayden Senger, really good defensive catcher. He was eligible. The Mets did not put him on the roster. Nate Lavender, who turned a lot of heads in spring training last year, but underwent Tommy John surgery, so no real risk that a team's going to claim him. Matt Allen, eligible for the Rule 5. Obviously, I think the Mets are safe here because who knows when Matt Allen's going to start pitching again. He has just been completely derailed by injuries throughout his entire career up to this point, but it's crazy that he's now reached that window where he is Rule 5 draft eligible. I'm sure he won't be selected. I think the Mets are fine here. If there's anyone that gets picked, my guess is it's Mike Vasil. He's now spent a year and a half in AAA. A team that has no pitching might just view Vasil as a guy that they can throw in their rotation through the Rule 5 draft, see what happens. I'm not sure who that team would be. If there is, like the White Sox, for example, I guess might jump out as a team that just could use an arm, can use a warm body. They might grab him. But other than Mike Vasil, I'd be pretty surprised if the Mets lost anyone to the Rule 5 draft. Now, another deadline today, qualifying offers. The decision had to be made. Everybody but Nick Martinez in Major League Baseball declined their qualifying offer. Nick Martinez agreed to come back to the Reds for $21.05 million. Surprisingly, Nick Pivetta did not take that opportunity, so he's going to be a free agent. The Red Sox, I guess, read the room right on that one. And the Mets did as well when it comes to Sean Manaea, which was a layup. But Luis Severino declined the qualifying offer. I thought if he accepted it, it would have been a good thing for the Mets. You can't be mad at a one-year deal for a pitcher, and Sevy proved his value this past year, but he's going to look to hit the open market, try to get a multi-year deal. And this is really good for the Mets because they are now in line to get 3 draft picks after the 4th round as compensation for Sean Manaea, Luis Severino, and Pete Alonso when they're all signed. Now, remember, we talked about this on yesterday's show. There is some steep penalties that come with being a luxury tax team, signing another team's player who's been extended the qualifying offer. You give up your 2nd round pick, your 5th round pick, and $1 million international bonus pool money. And I talked yesterday about how that could impact not only your international spending, but also how you spend in the draft because your 2nd round pick carries a big slot value, as does your 5th round pick. And if you sign a 2nd player that has a qualifying offer, you're giving up your 3rd and your 6th round pick and also the slot value that's attached to those picks. Last year, the Mets had given up all 4 of those picks. You're talking about 40% of your budget that you could spend on the draft that would have been washed away. So now you could offset that a bit because you're going to get the slot value attached to these comp picks that come after the 4th round. When you're a luxury tax team, you don't get a 1st round pick, even if you have a Pete Alonso that signs a $200 million deal elsewhere. It doesn't matter. You just get comp picks after the 4th round. But because the Mets have 3 players that got qualifying offers, they're going to get 3 picks. So that could really offset a 2nd and a 5th round pick. 3/4, it doesn't quite amount to the same slot value that you would give up, I'm sure, if the Mets signed a Juan Soto, let's say. The money's not going to be dollar for dollar, but it's definitely going to get you closer, and it's going to really offset the 5th round pick you're giving up for sure and eat into some of the value you're losing on that 2nd round pick. So I think the Mets are in a really good spot with this. In some ways, they're incentivized not to sign those 3 guys because they get the draft pick. With that said, if you can bring back Pete Alonso or Sean Manaea, I still think you go for it. In some respects with Luis Severino, I think you're either going to sign him to a very team-friendly deal because he looks out in the market and that qualifying offer really drags his market down, and maybe he comes back to the Mets and it's like, all right, I'll take 3 years, $45 million. Now all of a sudden you're looking at a value contract. It's worth it. Otherwise, I think you're best off letting Sevy sign somewhere else, collecting that comp pick for him. But it was obviously the right move to extend that to Severino because he's declined it. You now have some value coming your way. If you think about those signs the Mets made last year, for Sean Manaea, it was 2 years, $28 million with an opt-out. For Severino, 1 year, $14 million. You got 180 innings apiece from those guys, sub-4 ERAs, two guys that took the ball and helped you on a run where you were 2 wins away from the World Series, and now you get some comp picks back. It's remarkable value the Mets extracted in the free agent market last year. Final piece of housekeeping to discuss for the day. Carlos Mendoza did not win the Manager of the Year. He finished third behind Pat Murphy, who won the award, and Mike Shildt of the Padres, who came in second. I think Pat Murphy was deserving of this award because we're just talking about the regular season. We're not talking about the playoffs. Now, if I had a vote, I'm biased. I would have voted for Carlos Mendoza, but am I livid that he did not win this award? No, because it's a regular season award. If they voted for this after the playoffs, I'd be pissed because Carlos Mendoza clearly proved that he was the Manager of the Year when you look at the totality of taking a team that was 11 games under, leading them to the playoffs, and then beyond that, leading them past Pat Murphy's Brewers in the wild card round, past the Phillies, the team that had, was it the best record? I guess the second best record behind the Dodgers, and to win 2 games against the eventual World Series champion. I believe Carlos Mendoza was very deserving of that Manager of the Year. But you look at Pat Murphy and what he did with the Brewers, a team that going into the season, many thought were going to completely fall off. They said, man, you lost Craig Counsell. You don't have Corbin Burns. They traded him right before the spring training. Brandon Woodruff had the shoulder surgery, so he's out. What are you going to do? How are you going to offset losing 2 major pitchers? Devin Williams, I believe, went down pretty early as well. And the Brewers ran away with that Central Division. So I really can't get mad at Pat Murphy winning this award because he was very deserving. And I think I would have been more upset if Mike Shildt won it just because the Padres have a ton of talent. And I think the managerial job that Carlos Mendoza did to get the Mets where he did compared to what Shildt had to do to get the Padres where they were. I think Mendoza should have been second, but at the same time, we're splitting hairs. It's a managerial award. There's no stats for managers other than records. And I think ultimately they got the right 3 guys on the podium, and probably based on expectations and final results of the regular season. Remember how good the Brewers were during the 162. It makes sense that Pat Murphy won it. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. On tomorrow's show, we're going to continue our off-season coverage. Might be talking pitching tomorrow, but we'll see if some news items drop into our lap, like the Jose Siri trade today, and we can react to some more Mets news. Until then, though, thank you for watching. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider and be part of our texting service, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Also, check out justbaseball.com. I'm going to have my top 20 free agents with contract and team landing spot predictions. So if you're into reading about some great baseball coverage, make sure you check out Just Baseball because that's a piece I put a lot of time into, and we're releasing that on Wednesday morning. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first watch or your first listen every day. Now for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything, the world of sports, with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. My Locked On Sports Today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.